Welcome to the Central Arkansas Library's theater, the Ron Robinson Theater. I'm Nate Coulter, the Executive Director of the library. And we are excited to have, I think, one of the youngest and most successful political biographers around. We were just talking a few minutes ago. I think this won't be his last biography based on the success of it. McKay Coppins is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics, religion, and national affairs. He's the New York Times bestselling author of this book he's going to talk about tonight, Romney, A Reckoning, a biography of Mitt Romney. And he has The Wilderness, which was a 2015 book about the battle of the future of the Republican Party. He's a former visiting fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, where I think he became friends with David Axelrod, his subject for the biography's nemesis in the 2012 campaign when he was working for Obama. He's won the Aldo Beckman Award from the White House Correspondents Association for his coverage of the Trump presidency and the Wilbur Award for religion journalism. He lives near Washington with his wife and children. He grew up in suburban Boston. And I actually came upon his writing. I'd been a long-time subscriber of The Atlantic, but in about January, February of 21, there was an extended piece in The Atlantic about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its evolving identity as the real American religion. And as it was coming into its identity, the United States was having a collective crisis of identity. And he writes this wonderful piece that's about his own personal experience, and it's about the church's evolution. But there was a passage from it that I went back and found today that I think tells you a little bit about our guest. He's doing mission work in North Texas in Dallas when he's 19 or 20. And he writes, I quickly realized that my knack for playing the likable Mormon would come in handy in the Bible Belt. Likability, it turned out, was a big part of the job. With our black name tags and IBM salesman uniforms, missionaries were walking billboards for the church. We were trained to take rejection in stride, to cling to our good-natured wholesomeness no matter what. When a Baptist minister condemned you to hell, you smiled politely and complimented his landscaping. When somebody hurled a big gulp at you from a passing car, you calmly collected the cup and looked for the nearest trash can. Once in the seedy apartment complex where I lived with another missionary, we made the mistake of leaving our laundry unattended and returned to find it drenched in urine. Not wanting to make a scene, we shrugged and pumped more quarters into the washing machine. So he comes by dealing with politicians and politics and division from his earliest years. The New York Times said about his book, Romney, A Reckoning is in many ways a straightforward biography, but it has the intimacy of a small subgenre of political confessions. One remembers Monica Corley's Nixon Off the Record and Thomas DeFrank's Write It When I'm Gone, a collection of opinions that Gerald Ford wanted to make public, though not too soon. The Times reviewer continues, Romney has not waited until he's dead to unleash his candor and surrender his journals. Coppin, a fellow Mormon, is generally as polite as his subject. Through the characterization of Romney's late-in-life attempt at political repentance, though the characterization of Romney's late-in-life attempt at political repentance seems a bit stark. As this able book shows, Romney almost certainly has less to repent of than the average politician. Indeed, one believes Coppins when he says that, quote, watching Trump complete his conquest of the GOP was even more devastating to Romney than losing his own election in 2012. Let's welcome McKay Coppins to Little Rock.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I can honestly say I think it's the first of all the events I've done for this book, the first time anybody has talked about my laundry getting peed on in the introduction as a Mormon missionary, so I appreciate that.
I think I told you when I first contacted you by email how impressed I was with that piece. It was I'm sure stressful to write, but it was thorough and it was enlightening for someone who's grown up in the Bible Belt, but not a Baptist.
I have a lot of affection for the Bible Belt, urinating on laundry notwithstanding.
He did tell me when I picked him up that he'd gone back to Dallas last week and he found that apartment complex. So tell us about how you got this kind of access to Mitt Romney and what the terms of your agreement with him was. You worked with him for about 2 years, I think, in close quarters at his house or maybe in his Senate office hideaway or not very high-profile places. But tell us about the relationship and how it led to this essentially sharing all these intimate expressions by text, email, and his personal journal.
Yeah, it was interesting. First of all, thank you for bringing me here and to the library and for all of you for being here. You know, I had covered Mitt Romney for a long time. One of my first political reporting jobs was as a young reporter covering his presidential campaign in 2012. I had profiled him for The Atlantic when he arrived in the Senate and had kind of kept in touch with him. But after the events of January 6th, I could tell that he was going through something. He was, you know, asking himself really difficult questions about what had happened to his party and what was happening to the country. And though he didn't make it explicit at first, I could sense he was also asking himself questions about whether he had been complicit in any of this. And so I basically went to him. It's kind of probably the most audacious request I've ever made as a journalist. I went to him and I said, look, I think you are in the position to be the subject of a really fascinating political biography. I think you have a story to tell. I think you've seen a lot and told very little of it publicly. And I want to write this book. But here's my stipulation. I want all the access that I would get for an authorized biography, but I don't want to give up any editorial control. So I'll let you read it before it's published, and I'll talk to you about any concerns you have, but I'm ultimately going to be the one who decides what's going to be in this book. And I'll be honest, I thought that he would, kind of send me away, right? Because that's a ridiculous request to make of somebody who's still in office.
Show me all your secrets, and I'll decide which ones are important.
Exactly. I'll decide exactly how to frame them and present them to the world. And I told him, I said, look, if you don't feel like you're ready to be fully candid right now, that's totally understandable. Maybe we can revisit this down the road. Luckily for me, he took that as a dare almost, and immediately had his scheduler block off a weekly meeting every time he was in Washington. We usually met, like you said, in his house or his hideaway at night when most of his staff had gone home. He started sending me his journals, his email correspondence with high-level Republican politicians. And I think
You're looking at these and saying, I can't believe I got this.
I remember the first time, yes, the answer is yes.
Has he lost his mind?
I remember the first time, we had just kind of started working on it. We were a couple months in, and I was actually sitting in church on Sunday morning, and I got a text from him. It said, hey, McKay, I sent you something that might be of interest before our next meeting. And I looked at my email, and it was just hundreds of pages of his personal journals that I hadn't even asked for. And I was like, wow, all right, he's really in.
He's all in with this.
He's all in. And then I spent the rest of church reading his journals, obviously.
What I want to know is, was he in church sending you those journals?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did have that thought. I should have asked. But, it was clear from the beginning that he wanted to unburden himself. And as much as I would like to take credit for kind of like coaxing all of this out of him, and we did have some pretty, personal conversations, and I pressed him on things, but the reality is he was ready to do this.
So before 2021, January, February, March into 21, you had covered him in 2012, but as I think I've heard you say, the campaign, at least the people running the campaign, were not too keen about having another Mormon on the campaign plane and the bus. They relegated you. You got no scoops in that process.
He never gave me an interview. I never was able to interview him. And it's funny because I think my editor had hired me thinking like, oh, the Mormon reporter will get tons of access to the candidate. It was the opposite. They did not want, because if you remember this, I mean, this feels like ancient political history, but his religion was not very helpful to him politically. And his campaign consultants had effectively decided, we don't want to talk about this at all. And I was this annoying young reporter writing stories about his religion all the time. And so
what was the Sturt Stevens line? This was in the 2012 campaign, wasn't it?
So he said, as Romney set out to win the Republican nomination, he said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, the base of our party is Southern, evangelical, and populist, and you're a rich Mormon Yankee. We're going to have to steal the nomination. And that's kind of what they ended up doing.
So that's why they hid you somewhere. They didn't want to have you. But so you would have covered him in the 2018 campaign, I guess. So I'm trying to figure out how well did he know you when he approached you, and you approached him with this audacious request in 2021?
I think he had read my work, and he was aware of me because I had covered his campaign like he was aware of any reporter. We really didn't know each other. What's weird is that I grew up in Massachusetts in kind of the same very small Massachusetts Mormon world that Mitt Romney existed in, but I don't have any memory of ever crossing his path. My parents claim that I met him when I was a very young child. We were at apparently a Blockbuster video, and they bumped into him, and he recommended the movie So I Married an Axe Murderer. And that is my parents' one story about him. But we really didn't know each other. And so it took some time for him to get to know me and to kind of win his trust. But by the time we started working on the book, again, I think he had sort of decided that he was ready to unburden himself, and I was there, so I was the beneficiary.
Well, let me ask this. You've described the terms. It was essentially authorized, but you had complete editorial control. Do you think it landed well with him in all regards, or are there things that he regrets?
We were talking a little about this backstage. I said I think that Mitt kind of went through the cycles of grief once the book came out. He liked it when he first read it, but there were things that he didn't like and that he disagreed with. And then I think there was a period where he started to, before it was published, he kind of panicked when he considered how many relationships would be damaged within his party, how many people would be mad at him. But he had gone into this project with the feeling that it was important to tell the truth about what he had seen behind closed doors. And so he eventually made peace with it. There are still things I know he doesn't like in the book. There are things that we just disagree about.
You want to tell us one of those? Oh,
there are so many. One of them has to do with his relationship with Donald Trump. He famously in 2012 accepted Donald Trump's endorsement when he was running for president.
Tell that story, but he knew it was going to be unpleasant.
He didn't want to do it. So this is, if you cast your minds back, Donald Trump in 2012 had just become this kind of conservative political celebrity because he was championing the various conspiracy theories around Barack Obama and whether he was really born in the United States. And he was going on Fox News all the time saying, we need to see his birth certificate. And this had made him kind of a popular gadfly on the right. Mitt Romney tells me that one day during the primaries, in the heat of the primaries, one of his advisors came to him and said, you're going to have to let Donald Trump endorse you. And Mitt Romney kind of was like, oh, come on. And the reason was that he thought Donald Trump was a buffoon, right? But he also is and a lot of the book deals with this. He has an enormous capacity for self-rationalization, right? And he cops to this. He talks about this. And I actually think this is a pretty common theme in our political era. But he basically...
I'll come back to that, yes.
He basically talked himself into the idea that, look, if I don't accept Trump's endorsement, he'll endorse some other Republican. like Newt Gingrich or
I can manage him. That's what the
yeah, like, it's better to have him inside the tent, and I don't have to listen to him, but I'll do the, I'll stand on a stage with him for 5 minutes. By the way, you should go home and watch that 5 minutes of him on stage with him. It's one of the funnier moments.
Wasn't there a ruse that Romney himself, you tell about in the book, that Romney creates he didn't want cameras?
Well, this was, he didn't, the first time he met with Trump, but this was before that
Before the endorsement.
Yes, to solicit the endorsement, to kiss the ring. He didn't want any cameras there. So his campaign created this like elaborate ruse to lure the press to one side of Trump Tower so Romney could sneak in the back so that there would be no footage of him meeting with him. Eventually he gave in, he had this event. That 5 minutes where he's standing on stage in Las Vegas with him, you can tell Romney is just completely humiliated by the whole thing.
But he did say something like, there's sometimes in your life you have things happen to you you could never imagine, or something like that.
And he said, this is one of them. So he realized the absurdity. But the thing to go back to your question about things we disagree about, something that we disagree on still, and we kind of argued about this over the course of 2 years, was that he just fundamentally, he's in retrospect chagrined that he had that meeting, that he took that endorsement. Obviously, given everything that came after, he thinks it was a mistake. But he fundamentally just doesn't believe that his willingness to kind of accommodate Trump back in 2012 had anything to do with Trump's subsequent rise to power in 2016. And I think that there's more of a case than he's quite willing to admit, and I write about that in the book. And so I think some of that stuff he bristles at. And there are a bunch of other things he bristles at, but ultimately I think that he has made peace with what's in the book, and he's had enough people close to him come up to him in the last several months since the book was published, kind of telling him, I'm glad you told this story and you kind of bore your soul, because I think ultimately it's important for history to have these stories out there. And even though he's now a complete pariah in the Republican Party, the people who he respects have convinced him it was worth doing.
Do you get the sense that the blowback in his party came in the form of just ostracization, ignoring him, or were they just telling him, scorching him personally?
It was a combination of things. I mean, I remember after the book came out, I asked somebody in his office, how are things going for you? And
how are the calls coming?
Yeah, and it was a lot of angry calls. I mean, as you can imagine, there were death threats and very angry emails and letters. He also skipped the Republican caucus meetings for a little while to let things cool down. But I mean, look, he had made up. He knew when he went into this that his career in Republican politics was effectively over, and to his credit, decided on his way out to tell the truth about what he'd seen inside the party in a way that a lot of his colleagues have not done.
The subtitle, A Reckoning, I guess, is important, as most subtitles are. What's the story of how you came to that? 'Cause it strikes me that maybe it could have been something like rationalization or some other...
Yeah, the reckoning, I think there are a few different reckonings going on in this book, right? And I saw it firsthand, and this is what was interesting. On the one hand, he was reckoning with what he feels the Republican Party has become, which is he fears that it's given a large, I mean, one of the first meetings we had, he told me, a very large portion of my party doesn't really believe in the Constitution. And that was a realization that he had come to after January 6th. And so he was reckoning with what that meant. He's reckoning with the state of American democracy in general. He's very worried about how long America can survive as a republic. In fact, in that same meeting, again early on, he took me to this wall in his office where he has this map. It's called the Histo map. And it was first drawn in the early 20th century, and it basically charts the rise and fall of the greatest civilizations in human history. So you have the Romans and the Greeks and the Assyrians, and he took me to that map to make the point that I I look at this map now, he said when he first hung it in his office, he just thought it was kind of an interesting curiosity. And now after January 6th, he became obsessed with it, and he would find himself looking at it late at night in his office. And he said, I look at this map now, and what stands out to me is how few of these civilizations are democratic in any meaningful way, right? The history of human civilization is a series of kings and kaisers and autocrats and emperors.
Self-governing is an exception.
It's an exception, and it's an experiment, and we take it for granted. And he is no longer sure that we can count on it existing, generations into the future. And so that part of the reckoning that's going on is his own reckoning and what he hopes will be America's reckoning with that reality. But then there's also, I think this is what you got at, the third reckoning is a personal one. And he spent a lot of time over our 2 years together considering what role he had played in kind of coddling or indulging the extremist forces in his party. And one of the most interesting things about him and what made him a compelling subject for me was how he analyzed his own capacity for rationalization and his colleagues' capacity for rationalization. Because if you think of really this fraught moment in American politics, I think you could argue that the road to this moment has been paved by thousands of small moral compromises made by political leaders who had convinced themselves that they weren't really compromises. They had rationalized doing things to get reelected, to stay in the good graces of their party. And the MIT really was able to kind of expose the psychology of politicians who talk themselves into doing things that they know aren't really right. And I think that
surely that was in part because he had done it himself.
No question. That's why. I mean, I think that the reason that he was in some ways so judgmental of it is because he knew he had been guilty of it himself. And we talked about it. I mean, one of the things he gave me was his journal entries from the 2012 presidential campaign. He kept really detailed journals throughout that whole election because he thought there was a good chance he would become president, and he thought it was important to have this record.
Sense of history.
Yeah, exactly. If he's going to write presidential memoirs or whatever. Once he ended up losing, he said, I'm never going to write another memoir.
Give those to some reporter someday.
Yeah, you can have them, whatever. But he, in those journals, you see him grappling every day with these small compromises that you have to make when you're running for president, or at least he felt he had to make. And, one thing that I kind of learned about him, and this was the product of some pretty testy conversations we had after he read the manuscript, something that became clear was
two Mormons having a testy conversation. That's sort of interesting.
You can't imagine. There are a lot of dangs and hecks and,
There is one great passage in the book where you talk about when he's in Utah and saves the Olympics. And
so somebody accused
he gets intensely focused on trying to manage the parking or something, right?
Yeah. And somebody claimed that he used the F word, which he took very strong objection to, and said,
"I only use biblical curse words."
Yes, that's what he said. I only use biblical swear words.
So anyway, back to your testy conversation. I'm sorry.
So this testy conversation we had was basically, he felt that in the first draft of the book I wrote, I had made it seem like his rationalization was born of kind of a lack of conscience. And what I ultimately, he didn't quite put it this way, but what I ultimately realized about him as we talked was that it's actually that he had kind of an overactive conscience that was constantly pulling him away from what his consultants were telling him to do or what the base of his party wanted him to do. And so the conflict between what he knew was right and what his political ambitions were telling him to do, the way that he would mentally resolve that was through rationalization. He would talk himself into believing that the politically advantageous thing to do was the right thing to do. And I think that is actually really revealing about him, but it's really revealing about a lot of political leaders.
Yeah, I think there are probably some of us in this room who've run for office. I see at least one of my friends who's been a candidate here. And I think it would be impossible for any self-aware, candid person who's ever run for office to deny that those tensions aren't happening all the time. You know, there are people who are your handlers and your advisors and people who read polls or focus group data who want you to say certain things. And to the extent you have an active conscience, you're rebelling against some of that, and you're trying to say, well, there's some core things here. I'm not going to, don't come talk to me about this. I'm not going back down there. But it's a constant thing. So why do you think Romney's struggle with that is any different from the garden variety politician who does it routinely?
I don't know that it is that different, except that he realized it while he was still in office, and kind of his self-awareness made it more interesting, right? Because what was so interesting for me is...
Well, it also may have caused him to be awkward at some of this. You know, I think about
no question.
things that he uttered that seemed, I'm a severe conservative, or...
So I do think that what you're describing is partly the consequence of the fact that he was just always pretty misaligned with the base of his party, right?
When he talked about his fondness for hunting, what did he describe?
He said, somebody asked if he somebody asked if he was a hunter, and he said, oh yeah, I've hunted for a long time. And they said, well, what do you hunt? And he said, you know, small varmints, things like
varmints,
that.
That's the word.
The reality, actually, by the way,
he hates hunting.
Yeah, I found in his journals he describes being dragged onto some hunting trip with some friend after he had, after his presidential election. He said, I spent 3 days, not a single shot fired, standing around in the cold, wet. Why do people do this? So he's really not much of a hunter.
Well, there was Etch-a-Sketch. I remember that one sort of got him in trouble, and so some of that was natural. That's just his lexicon or his syntax.
The other thing that's going on there is though to understand, you have to understand his father. And at the first chapter,
that may have been one of the reckonings too. Reckoning with George.
So George Romney was the liberal Republican governor of Michigan.
There are a few of us here who might remember that liberal Republican was a thing.
Yes,
at one
this
point.
was back when that existed.
When I went to college, there was something called the Liberal Republican Student Group. So
yeah,
I think they had a name like it was the Lincoln Group or the Lincoln Log Cabin or some group like that. So they haven't existed in a while.
Not I mean,
not in these latitudes.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say maybe you could argue still in the New England and certain places like that, but when George was entering politics, he had been an auto executive and kind of was like a self-made.
So early
man.
60s.
This is in the early 60s. He was elected governor of Michigan, and planted his flag firmly in the liberal wing of the party. He was an advocate for civil rights. He marched with civil rights protesters in Michigan, and he when he ran for president. In 68.
Twice. Oh, did he run in 64 and 68 or 60?
He just ran in 68, though he had the misfortune of entering Republican politics right as Barry Goldwater and the conservatives
So he was at the convention in 64, and his youngest son...
Mitt was there. That's right. So he was at the convention where Barry Goldwater accepted the nomination. And Mitt was there as a teenager, just accompanying his dad. His dad had gone to kind of fight against the forces that were, the extremist conservative forces, and realized that it was a lost cause pretty quickly. Barry Goldwater actually kind of repudiated George Romney's wing of the party and George Romney himself implicitly in his convention speech.
Famous statement he gave.
Yeah, so Goldwater said in that speech that
moderation in the defense of
in defense of liberty is no
extremism.
Vice. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. That was a direct
moderation in the defense of, or moderation in the pursuit of freedom is no virtue.
Yeah, that's right. And he anyway, the point is, George Romney at one point seemed like he was going to be the Republican nominee. Goldwater lost. 4 years later, George Romney ran. It looked like he had a good shot at winning the nomination, and his campaign was taken down by a single interview he gave, where he he said that he had changed his position on the Vietnam War because his initial support was a consequence of the generals brainwashing him. And what he meant was basically that the U.S. government is selling us a bill of goods.
Spinning him.
Yeah, and we were spun. But brainwashing became the headline. It just evoked weird imagery, and people, didn't like it. Republicans piled on. It sank his campaign. What Mitt took from that was both that he idolizes his dad. His dad, in Mitt's mind, was the embodiment of integrity in public service. But he also had in his mind, when he entered politics himself decades later, that a single poorly chosen word can end your political career. And so Mitt's entire political career, really until just these last few years, was kind of defined by a fear of saying the wrong thing. And of course, when you're constantly living in fear of saying the wrong thing, you say the wrong thing all the time, which is what he ended up doing.
And the irony was that because he thought it was a private donor meeting when a bartender, somebody had turned the camera on.
The 47%, yeah. This is when Mitt said that 47% of Americans will never vote for me because they won't take responsibility for their own lives and they don't pay taxes. And, I write all about that in the book. He obviously regrets that a lot. But again, the thing that was most painful in that moment is that he felt like he was repeating history.
Let his father down, maybe.
Exactly.
And there's a funny part about that. There was some grad student thesis about his father's campaign's demise that Mitt found somewhere
in the BYU archives, found a 1969 master's thesis about why George Romney had lost the election. He printed out copies and made the senior advisors of his presidential campaign read it. And that just kind of shows you how much he is both inspired by and haunted by his father's legacy. And I do think that one of the interesting things about this final chapter of Mitt's career is that he's trying to live up to his dad's legacy in a way he never quite did. Like, George Romney ultimately is remembered as the guy who spoke truth to power. He spoke out against the right wing of his party. He stood for his principles even when it cost him. And Mitt has tried to do that in the final chapter while he feels like he didn't quite live up to that legacy earlier on.
So one of the things that's probably of interest to people here is some of the observations that are in the journals from the 2008 campaign when he comments about some of his rivals. And he also projects some comments. I think there's a comment that he says in the journal Anne had about Newt Gingrich after she first met him.
After Anne first met him.
Anne encountered Newt Gingrich, and Mitt writes in the journl.
Anne said that he's a megalomaniac and that he needs psychiatric help or something like that. There's a whole, there are a long list of withering comments made about various prominent Republicans, though. I think the one you're about to get at.
He wasn't a big fan of our then our former governor, who was a Republican primary rival,
Mike Huckabee. Yes, some of the most withering comments in his journals were about Mike Huckabee. So if you remember, they ran against each other in the 2008 Republican primaries. And Mitt actually had already met Huckabee years earlier when they were both governors at a conference for governors. And as Mitt tells it, they were at a hotel together for this this conference, and Huckabee had found out that he had a worse conference room than Mitt, and threw an elaborate tantrum about it, and demanded to speak to the manager and berated staffers, and that was Mitt's first encounter with Huckabee. So he took away from that beneath kind of Huckabee's aw shucks, wholesome persona, there might be kind of a more ruthless edge to him.
Well, you say, and these are quotes, there was Mike Huckabee, you're introducing, the affable governor of Arkansas, who was busy carving out his spot as the field's evangelical standard bearer. A former Baptist minister, He was quick with a folksy aphorism and skilled at bringing every political discussion back to Jesus. He was also, in Romney's private estimation, a, quote, huckster. And I assume these quotes are from the Journal, the very, quote, caricature of a for-profit preacher. Yes.
So Mike Huckabee is not on Mitt's Christmas card list.
I told you I thought that might be. Well, it actually got a little more problematic, and I think it relates to a bigger issue that, having grown up in Massachusetts, I think you probably relate to this. The attitude about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Massachusetts is different than it is in the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
So we're in South Carolina in the primary in 2008, and Mitt and Ann and maybe some of their sons are meeting with some evangelical leaders whom they're courting, and a evangelical preacher tells Mitt, if you win, more people are going to hell.
That's right. He said, look, and actually Mitt almost respected that this guy leveled with him. He said, look, you seem like a nice guy. I like a lot of what you have to say, but I am never going to support you because if you win, more people are going to go to hell. And Mitt said, well, why? And this preacher said, look, Mormons are going to hell. And if a Mormon becomes president, more people will become Mormon, and that more people are going to go to hell. And my job is to save souls.
You'll make Mormon vogue, and people will follow you.
That's right.
Hell.
By the way, I don't think that many more people would have become Mormon if Mitt Romney was president. That just as an aside.
It's the fastest growing faith in the world, isn't it?
I think we're doing okay with or without Mitt Romney. But no, I mean, look, but that attitude was something that that was an extreme manifestation of it. But this was something that
and the Baptist preacher who was his opponent got close to that. He was telling reporters that isn't it true that Mormons believe the devil was Jesus' brother?
Yeah, that's right. Mike Huckabee found a lot of kind of ways to dog whistle the anti-Mormon stuff when he was running against Mitt. And, it's interesting. Like you said, Mitt didn't grow up in a place with a lot of Mormons. Michigan doesn't have that many Mormons, and Massachusetts doesn't either. So his adult life was spent in a place without many Mormons. But he had not encountered the kind of religious hostility to Mormonism that he encountered once he started running for president as a Republican presidential candidate. And, I think it took a toll on him. In 2008, his sons, he has 5 sons, they were all in to help him, right? And they were campaigning across Iowa. One of his sons bought an old Winnebago and committed to going to all 99 counties of Iowa to campaign for his dad. And they would it was every diner they went into, every event they went to, people would say, you don't believe in the same Jesus as me. And, it was just this kind of constant barrage. And after that first campaign, when he lost, he had made up his mind that he was never doing this again, never running again, in part because he didn't want to put his family through it, right? I think that he eventually, in 2012, he made peace with it a little more. He didn't talk about religion as much.
You on the back of the bus.
He kept me on the outside. That's right. But I think what bothers him now is that a lot of those conservative evangelicals who couldn't bring themselves to vote for him because of his Mormonism enthusiastically lined up to vote for Trump 4 years later.
Right. If you had 2 profiles, you've got one guy who's been married to his high school sweetheart, is going to church even on some Sundays. Maybe he's texting a reporter, but he's he's very faithful, and by all accounts has a great marriage. Family is supportive of, and you have this other guy.
Yeah,
who's been married a number of times.
Who theatrically boasts about his affairs and mistresses and all of that, and who very clearly
Christians go for that guy.
Well, right, and so this was the thing that I think still bothers him. And he, throughout our conversations, Mitt, he didn't want to. He tried to train his criticism on Republican leaders, Donald Trump first and foremost, but then other people who had enabled him. I think he learned his lesson from that 47% episode that it's not his role as a political leader to criticize voters. And I think that's true. I think political leaders should try to lead voters, not complain about them or criticize
Obama
them.
learned that too when he was talking about the people in Pennsylvania.
That's exactly right.
Think of their God.
This is a lesson that a lot of candidates have to learn. But you can tell that it eats at him, and he cannot understand how sincerely devoted religious people can, come around to supporting someone like
So
Donald
what
Trump.
it proves is it's not just the candidates who are rationalizing things, it's the voters.
It's the voters. I think that's true. And I think, by the way, this isn't just an evangelical phenomenon. There are, plenty of Mormon voters who are doing the same thing. And I think he's more upset about that than anything because it's his own family, right? It's his clan.
They're a little they're more lukewarm than most predominantly Republican states in Utah than on
That's true. There's quite a bit of data. I mean, this is part of what
that was part of your story.
Well, and this is part of what's, I think, worth understanding about Mitt Romney. Because people always ask me, did he open up to you because you're Mormon, right? And I would be lying if I said that had nothing to do with it. In fact, in one of our early conversations, he said, I think it's a benefit that you get the Mormon thing. And I said, I didn't totally know what he meant by that, but eventually something he said really, I think, became important to our conversations. He said, growing up outside of Utah in our faith, you get used to being different in ways that are important to you. And I think that experience he had growing up Mormon, in a place of very few Mormons, has really informed this last chapter of his political career because he has been very unpopular in the Republican caucus in the Senate, right? His colleagues think he's a traitor. He gets, death threats. People shout at him from car windows when he's walking around. But I understood.
Like having big gulp thrown on you.
That's right. People pee on his laundry. No, just kidding. That part is just me. No, but I think that I related to that. I grew up in Massachusetts as a Mormon. And so I don't know that it was we didn't have some kind of Mormon, bond, but we had a specific kind of bond, both having grown up Mormon in non-Mormon places, that helped me understand how he had gone through these last few years of being pretty isolated and pretty lonely, frankly, in his political career.
So I think George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton became sort of maybe unexpectedly, paradoxically good friends after they had run against each other in 1992. I didn't get the sense from your book that Obama and Romney bonded like that.
No, although I do think there a mutual respect has developed since their campaign. I mean, one thing that Mitt thought was funny rereading his own journals, because he gave them to me and then had the thought, maybe I should read these, but he had already given them to me.
I've done that before on a smaller scale, like, should I have sent that?
So he went back and reread, for example, the campaign journals in 2012, and he said, he was almost amused by how catastrophic he thought an Obama re-election would be for the country. And he said, it's funny, I read these entries, and I thought that the national economy would collapse and it would just be a disaster. And he said, in retrospect, and now with more time and experience and distance from the campaign, I can admit, first, that presidents have relatively little influence over the national economy, the global economy. They all pretend that they do, but the reality is they're often victims of events like everybody else, right? But he said more than that,
when the president can't control the price of gasoline?
Yeah, that's right, as much as voters seem to think they can. But more than that, he said he's come to the conclusion that the most important thing a president can do is set the kind of the moral the moral temperature in the country, right? He said the character of a president matters a lot because it trickles down to the rest of the country. It trickles down in politics, it trickles down in culture. And, he said, I still disagree with Barack Obama on all kinds of things, but on a character level, I think he's a good man. I think he's patriotic. I think he loves our country. He's trying to do the right thing. And I think that he took for granted that most of the people who became president met that baseline. And he
We've
now
all taken that for granted, but reassessed it in the last.
That's right. Well, and I think since then he's now realized it can get a lot worse than Barack Obama. And I will say, on the other side, I write about this in the book, after Mitt Romney took that famous impeachment vote to convict Trump, the only Republican, Obama sent him a handwritten letter congratulating him and thanking him.
The first impeachment.
The first impeachment,
Right.
that's right.
So I want to ask us if we can turn the lights down. Can you cue up the speech that Romney gave a speech to explain why he was doing that? And before we turn it on, a lot of his we'll come back to that picture. But go to the don't start it. But let me set it up a little bit. He was the first Republican, or the only Republican who voted for impeachment in February of January of was it February of 2020? February of 2020.
Yep.
The first impeachment, and he was the only one in the Senate to vote to convict.
The only Republican.
Only Republican, and he was to that point, the only person to ever vote for a president's impeachment of his own party.
He was the first senator in history to vote to convict a president of his own.
And even his friend, Paul Ryan, who had been running with him in 2012, called him up and tried to dissuade him from voting to convict, right?
Yeah, the last conversation he had before he went out to give his speech that we're about to watch a clip of was with Paul Ryan, who had somehow found out he was going to vote this way, called him and tried to talk him out of it. And that just gives you a sense, even people on his Senate staff, people very close to him, were kind of urging him not to do this. They were saying,
you recount that one of his close aides, when he said he was going to do it, put her head down?
Yeah, he told his senior staffers in the Senate office that he was going to vote to convict, and one of his staffers just put her head in her hands and didn't look up for the rest of the meeting. I mean, you have to, just to appreciate it, before we watch this clip, the pressure to vote to acquit with the rest of his party was enormous. I mean, and this guy had been the standard bearer of his party only a few years earlier. So every Republican donor, every Republican politician had gotten to know him, had supported him, and almost all of them were extremely disapproving of this decision. And so I read his journals at the time. Throughout the whole impeachment trial, he kept really detailed journals, going back and forth and agonizing over how to vote. He did not want to vote to convict. He knew that it would be political suicide. He was worried that it could lead to violent threats against his family. He thought he might have to leave Utah. But he ultimately decided that Trump was guilty of abuse of power and that he just couldn't, he couldn't take one more vote that he didn't really believe in. And so that's what we say.
The allegations made in the articles of impeachment are very serious. As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I am profoundly religious. My faith is at the heart of who I am. I take an oath before God as enormously consequential. I knew from the outset that being tasked with judging the president, the leader of my own party, would be the most difficult decision I have ever faced. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
So I know there's a passage at the end of the book where you recount how at some point Romney decides that politicians should think more about their obituaries than the next vote or the next cycle. And tell us in reaction or in the wake of hearing that, how you think that fits into his reckoning with his own conscience at the end of his political career.
Yeah, you know, well, first of all, let me say this. I asked him once if he would have taken this same vote if it had happened 30 years earlier in his career, right? Because he's at the end of his political career at this point. I said, if this had happened at the beginning of your political career, you had been placed in the same position, would you have taken the same lonely principled vote? And he thought about it, and he said, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. He said, I think I recognize now my capacity for self-rationalization in a way that I didn't 30 years ago. So I thought that was remarkably self-aware of him. But when I asked him, you know, are there any lessons to be learned from your experience that could be applied to future generations of political leaders, what he said was, I think that what would really change this country and our political culture is if politicians spend more time thinking about their obituaries than the next news cycle, right? How will you be remembered? What will be your legacy? And it was that kind of reframing that happened in his mind, especially in these last few years, that allowed him to take this vote. And I think that this will end up being in the first line of his obituary. I think that speech will be the most memorable speech he ever gave. And he's given a lot of, you know, he accepted the Republican nomination, he's spoken in large venues to tens of thousands of people. I think that speech will be the one that he's remembered for because it was a moment of moral courage. And I think that we are at a moment now in our politics where there is an epidemic of cynicism and fear and cravenness and cowardice, and we don't expect moral courage from our leaders anymore. And part of what made this book, you know, rewarding to write was that it was about a flawed politician who had not always demonstrated moral courage, discovering his courage at a moment where the stakes were high and division and fear were taking over the country. And I thought that was a story worth telling. And I think I mean, who knows, but I think it's the one he'll be remembered for.
And I think the tragedy is that it has not inspired more people to follow suit. One last question, then we'll let others ask you some questions if they want. 2 days ago, Mitch McConnell announced he'd leave the role of Republican leader after the election in the fall. He would be in the Senate for another 4 years, I think. And then today there's a piece by your colleague, Jonathan Martin, who came here after his book, This Will Not Pass. He's not at the Washington Post now, though. Where's he?
He's at Politico now.
That's Politico. Yeah. And he says that McConnell will endorse Trump because he wants to avoid being accused of causing disunity among Republicans. But here's the take that's so telling in contrast to what you just described about the subject of your book. Jonathan Martin. What McConnell cannot do, and scarcely has tried to do, is block Trump's comeback. The leader frittered away his best chance to do that by not even trying to gather the votes to convict Trump 3 years ago this month. That was the second impeachment that he was talking about. Now, McConnell isn't trying to stand up to the man he does not think has any business being president. He's trying to make the best of it for Republicans. And this is a quote in Jonathan's piece. Quote, as ever, he has his finger on the pulse of the conference and party and is willing to do what is best for both, said Billy Piper, one of McConnell's many loyal former chiefs of staff. continuing, that former employee, quote, his courage is unmatched and his ability to see the future and prepare for it will be missed. I'll just leave it there and see if you want to comment.
Well, I'll start by saying this. Mitt Romney's own relationship with McConnell was really complicated, and I write about this in the book, because in some ways, Romney admired McConnell's, management of his caucus, right? He is objectively incredibly skilled at, getting Republican legislation passed, getting Republican judges confirmed. And a lot of that stuff is stuff that Mitt Romney, believes in. He still is conservative in many ways. But where I think that they diverged was that when Trump came to power and started doing things that both McConnell and Romney knew and would admit in private were bad for the country, harmful to the republic, McConnell erred on the side of preserving Republican power and doing what was best for the party. Mitt Romney erred on the side of, or took the side of, doing what was best for the republic, even if it was at the expense of his party. And there's actually a moment, I write throughout the book about once Mitt Romney gets to the Senate, McConnell is constantly taking him aside in private conversations and saying, oh, I wish, you get to say the things that we can't say, and McConnell will call Trump an idiot and, say, I totally agree with everything you're saying. And this, he was not the only one. A lot of his colleagues would come up to him in private, Republican senators, and say, I'm with you 100%. I'm so glad you're out there doing what you're doing. I can't do that, but I'm glad you're doing it. And then they would look at him kind of expectantly, as though they thought he would be so grateful for their allyship, right? And it drove him insane because what he said was, I'm out here on a limb, right? I'm the only one out here criticizing the things that Trump is doing and trying to hold him to account. And all these colleagues secretly agree with me, but they won't say it out loud. And McConnell is, I think, the most clear example of this. It's very clear that he knows that Trump is a threat. He also, as that piece alludes to, had the opportunity after January 6th in the second impeachment trial to whip the votes, get 10 more Republican Senate votes, convict Trump, which would have meant he couldn't run for president again. And he balked, he didn't do it, because he ultimately decided that, it wasn't worth the political capital, it wasn't good for the party, and so...
Finally good for the country, but not the party.
That's right, and where McConnell has made that decision, Romney has, in these last few years, made the opposite decision, that he's prioritizing what he considers country over party. I think McConnell is emblematic of really the attitude throughout the Republican caucus.
I'm going to get you to indulge the locals in one more thing. Put that infamous picture back up there from the dinner.
Yeah, I was wondering when we get to this. I paid a lot of good money to get the rights for this photo to be in the book. After the 2016 election, when Trump won, Trump dangled the Secretary of State job in front of Mitt. I consider this the last temptation of Mitt. So Trump brought him first to his golf course in New Jersey, and then, how many people have seen this photo? Raise your hand. Almost everyone, right? It's a very famous photo. So this was the second meeting that they had about this job. This is in a restaurant at Trump Tower in Manhattan. And
Sometime
this was in December
of
of 2016. That's right. So shortly before Trump took office, after he'd been elected. And I love, my favorite thing about this photo, you can't quite see it in this lighting, but it looks like it's underlit somehow, as though like from the bowels of hell, the flames are coming up. But
The Last Temptation by the Devil.
that's exactly right. No, I mean, so what's going on in this meeting? I asked Ben about this, and I even showed him the picture. I was like, we got to talk about this picture. What's going through your head?
I'm not a Baptist or a Mormon, but I could work with this line of thought on a lot of text. Yeah.
So what he said was that, when Trump first approached, it was actually Mike Pence who first called him and said, do you want to meet with the president-elect about this job?
Romney, by the way, was no big fan of Pence.
No, he did not care for Pence. He said, nobody has done more to excuse the ungodly than Mike Pence, or something like that. The idea that Romney would join Trump's administration seemed ridiculous on its face. Romney
He had spent a lot of 2016, to his credit, with some of us, he had done all sorts of concrete tactical things to try to divide the remaining primaries up so that in one state he was trying to get people to support Kasich, one state he was trying to support Cruz, Marco, Rubio.
Yeah.
He had some strategy. He was actively trying to block Trump.
Actually, more than was reported at the time. A lot of this
Yeah,
is in the book. He was working behind the scenes.
That was news to me in the book. I had not realized
to
that.
prevent Trump from winning the nomination. Then after he won the nomination,
He gave a full-throated speech.
Yep. Opposing Trump, and he refused to ever endorse him or vote for him once he won the nomination. One of the few Republicans who didn't buckle. So the idea that he would join the administration was crazy. The way that he talked himself into at least taking the meeting was that he felt like Trump's election was an emergency and that he had no idea what he was doing in foreign affairs. And at the time, he was getting phone calls from former secretaries of state in both parties, Hillary Clinton, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. All these people were calling him and saying, if he offers you this job, you have to take it out of the good of, for the good of the country. So he took the meeting, but it was humiliating, right? I mean, this is the thing about entering Trump's orbit, and I've written about a lot of people, a lot of Republican politicians, is he extracts humiliation as to kind of show his dominance. This is what he does to Republican politicians. And so what ultimately this dinner culminated with was Trump, after the meeting, called Romney up and said, I want to make this happen. I want to give you the job. I want to bring you in the administration. But you've got to go out there and say, I take back everything I said in the campaign. And Mitch just said, look, that would be so ridiculous that I just can't do it. Like, nobody's going to believe it. It will be obvious that it's insincere. I won't feel good about it. What Mitt, I don't think, realized was that the sincerity wasn't the point. It was the dominance, right? The subjugation that Trump was after.
Well,
there was also a funny
our governor came up in that conversation.
I was going to say, there's also a funny moment in that conversation.
Our former governor.
Where Trump says, by the way, there are some people in my circle who really don't want you to join this administration. Rudy and Mike Huckabee, Rudy Giuliani, they hate you. Like, do you know that they hate you? And Mitt said, well, there's a good reason for that. I beat them. And Trump said, oh, okay, that's fair enough. But ultimately, Romney couldn't quite bring himself to grade himself to the level that Trump required, and so he didn't get the job. And of course, in retrospect, he's very glad that he didn't. But that's what was going on in this meeting.
Tillerson took the job for a short spell.
Yes, I think he lasted, 6 months, maybe?
So, questions? While you're thinking of some, let's give our guest a big round of applause. We have microphones, or you just shout it out and we'll repeat it, so it'll. Someone's here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you the difference between LDS and evangelicals when it comes to politics and how they respond to former President Trump.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Something I've written a lot about, including in that piece that Nate quoted from at the beginning. Up until 2016, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, were the most reliably Republican religious group in the country, actually. George W. Bush won something in his first election, won something like 80% of the Mormon vote. A typical Republican presidential candidate would win between 70 and 80%. When Donald Trump came along, it caused a real political crisis within American Mormonism. He ended up winning, I think, by the best metrics that I could find, about 50% of the Mormon vote. So there was it caused a real split among Mormons. And there are some interesting reasons that Mormons veered one way, while at least conservative evangelicals veered the other way. One has to do with Mormon missionary work. Some of us got stuck serving in Texas. Most got to go to foreign countries.
You said in the article you were
world.
praying to go to a foreign country, and you got Texas.
I was hoping for somewhere a little more exotic than Dallas. But no, I love my mission. But what I was going to say is that there are actually very strong pro-immigrant attitudes within Mormonism, even among very conservative Mormons. Mormons are more than twice as likely as white evangelicals to say that the country should welcome more immigrants.
You talk in the article about your church in Brooklyn. It was very diverse.
It's very diverse. The way that there's all kinds of interesting things. The way that the Mormon church structure exists in America and around the world is that you don't get to choose the congregation you go to. You're assigned to a congregation based on boundaries that are drawn to promote socioeconomic
There's
diversity
gerrymandering.
and racial diversity, exactly. And so people are they spend a lot of time worshiping with people who are not like them. There are all kinds of reasons that Mormons didn't respond to Trump's message the way that evangelicals did. What's interesting is that now we're 8 years into the Trump era, and I think what's happening now is that Mormon Republicans are becoming a little bit more inclined to Trump, but Mormons overall are becoming less Republican. You actually have seen a mass exodus of Mormons from the Republican Party in the Trump era, but those who have stayed have become kind of more MAGA-oriented. So it's an interesting split that continues to play out in Mormonism. I'm sure I'll continue to write about it.
Yeah, just a quick question. For starters, thank you for your research and your depth. Very entertaining, enlightening. But could you just touch on Romney's very controversial comment, right, that Russia is the most dangerous international threat? I'm just curious how that sat on his head, right, over the years to come to today, right? We have a U.S. representative here in Little Rock who visited Russia, right, French Hill, and of course now we have the Ukraine war. If you could just touch on that.
Yeah, it's a kind of interesting chapter that shows how much the politics of foreign policy in Russia in particular have been scrambled in the last 10 years. When Romney ran for president in 2012, he famously, in a debate with Barack Obama, was asked to identify the number one geopolitical foe to America. That was the question. And Romney said Russia. And Barack Obama kind of mercilessly ridiculed him for it in the debate. He said the Cold War called and they want their foreign policy back or something like that.
I would say Romney got the better of that exchange over as time passed.
In retrospect, in the moment, it didn't seem that way. It seemed like Obama had kind of, handled Romney. In retrospect, a lot of Democrats, including David Axelrod, who ran Obama's campaign, have come out and said, Mitt was right about that, we were wrong. But what's interesting is that I talked to Mitt actually right after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022.
2 years ago this month.
That's right. I talked to him about this, and he said, what's ironic is that Democrats have come around to my point of view just as my party has abandoned it, right? The most Republicans now are either reluctant to aid in the war effort against Russia or cheering for Russia, right? And so Romney, that I think more than almost any issue, has really dispirited him about when it comes to the future of the party, because he feels like the kind of isolationist wing of his party has cozied up to autocrats and Vladimir Putin in particular in a way that he feels like is just so anathema to the Republican Party that he grew up in, and it's kind of hard for him to understand.
Yes. How can he complain about the United States falling apart when he and the top 1% take away their wealth and put it in offshore bank accounts away from the taxpayer? And famously, economists have estimated close to $7 trillion of the world's wealth is stashed away in tax havens, and the governments will not reach that or don't want to do it. So how can he claim when he does the same thing and he says America is falling apart? He's part of the problem.
Yeah, well, you're getting at, I think, an interesting tension in,
Thank you for the
Mitt
question.
Romney's political reinvention, right? Which is that, on the one hand, he's become famous for these moments of speaking out against his party's new emerging orthodoxy and leaders like Donald Trump. But he remains kind of classically conservative on a lot of issues, including fiscal issues. And part of what has actually led him to be so skeptical of the Trump era is that he's fundamentally pretty anti-populist. And so that means he's
Anti-populist, left and right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So he's definitely against right-wing populism. He's also against left-wing populism. He's not, he doesn't have a lot of patience or time for kind of Bernie Sanders style socialism, and he's fundamentally a very committed capitalist. And so, it's funny because I would sometimes ask him about the strange new respect he has in Democratic circles, and he'd say, well, it'll only last as long as we actually start talking about fiscal policy again, and then they'll all remember why they hated me in the first place. But it's a fair critique. I won't try to defend it. I'm not his spokesman, but I think that you're getting at an interesting...
And it was one of the things that I think people forget how unpopular President Obama was in 2011, and one of the things that Axelrod and others did so astutely was to start talking about Bain Capital.
That's
and
right.
Going and getting these people who lost their jobs, were laid off because Bain had merged two organizations or had bought something public, taken it private, and people lost their jobs, and they had these people in the street who were affected by it, who lost their jobs, testifying about it.
Yeah.
There was one good line during that campaign in 2008 that our former governor said that Romney looked like the man who comes to tell you you're being laid off.
That's right. That he was right about that, and it was something that really hurt him in that campaign, especially. You remember we were in the middle of a very slow economic comeback after the financial crisis, so lots of people were out of work.
Over here?
One of Romney's greatest achievements as governor was the Romney Care, the health care plan. Of course, by the time he ran against Obama, that was sort of a thing that the Republicans are using to try to run against Obama. Did he ever regret the fact that he, sort of abandoned to me, one of his greatest achievements in Massachusetts in favor of the Republican campaign against Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah, so I asked him about this, and he would dispute the premise, first of all. He would say, I didn't ever abandon it. And he actually showed me once, just to prove his point. He had, one of the things he did early on was he went into a filing cabinet he had in his home office and to retrieve all the papers and documents he had from the 2012 campaign. And it was locked and he couldn't find the key, so he took a crowbar to it to open it. And then he kind of deposited the contents on my lap. And one of the things there was a legal pad where he had taken notes during a campaign meeting with his consultants about how to handle Romney Care. And he wrote in that meeting, Romney Care, stick with 100%. And then he presented it to me as like evidence that he had not abandoned his accomplishment. I think the reality is it's complicated. He definitely distanced himself from it. He certainly tried to argue that Obamacare was not modeled on Romney Care, even though it very clearly was. But something he told me, looking back on that whole episode that was interesting, is that, he said, when I see a problem, a public policy problem that I want to solve, I don't look at it and ask myself, what is the conservative solution to this problem? I try to figure out the best solution and then figure out a way to sell it to conservatives. And he said when it came to that Romney Care plan, he had kind of divided, the most controversial element was the insurance, the personal mandate, that everybody in the state had to get insurance or pay a fine. And he found, after he had already adopted this policy,
the Heritage Foundation idea,
that the Heritage Foundation had at one point endorsed an individual mandate. And so he trumpeted that as...
They did that when there was Hillary Care.
That's right.
They said, well, no, a better way is to require everybody to get insurance.
And so he went to conservatives and said, look, we're building on what Heritage has laid out. And he's like, the reality is I didn't know Heritage did anything when I came up with that policy, but I was just trying to sell it to conservatives. And so he, I think that he now, that he, with a lot of distance, he looks back on that as one of his greatest public policy achievements. He also, that is the kind of government work that he likes to do, getting stakeholders, bipartisan legislators in a room, hashing out details, hammering out a compromise, and then putting together complicated legislation. That's the stuff he likes to do, and I think one of the tragedies of his political career is he really hasn't gotten to spend that much time doing that.
I think one of the things that's critical to that part of him was that, I think I've heard you say this, maybe it's in the book, that he approached most policy issues with the attitude that there was a range of reasonable policies that you could pursue to solve this problem. And that therefore compromise was inevitable to get the range, within the range, to get the one that would work politically and so forth. The problem is that so many people now have taken the position that compromise is a sign of weakness or worse. You know,
or that changing your position or changing your mind is evidence of flip-flopping, when the reality, at least as far as he can tell, is that there are a lot of positions you could take that are reasonable, and it's okay to evolve to meet the moment. That just has, we're in a moment of we're in a moment of partisan litmus tests and ideological purity, and that was not well received when he was running for president.
There's one great line you have to share, that when they had the signing for Romney Care in Boston at the Capitol, I guess, Ted Kennedy's there, right? He's supporting this.
Ted Kennedy endorsed the bill. He was there for the signing, and he said, when Ted Kennedy and Mitt Romney both support a bill, you know one thing is true: one of them hasn't read it.
and Mitt had run against Kennedy in
'94.
Yes.
I'd like you to comment on about two aspects of your book. First one is, and I think it may have been in the 2012 meeting you alluded to between Trump and Romney, that you comment in the book that Romney found Trump charming and understood why people liked him. And I'd like you to comment about that. The other thing is you go into great depth about these candidates that are stupid, such as Rick Perry, but you also comment about the intelligent Republicans like the senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, and Josh Hawley, but you really didn't go into the relationship about another intelligent senator from Utah, Mike Lee, and the relationship between Romney and he. Could you comment about that also?
Sure. Remind me, the first question was about Trump. Right, yeah.
Being charming.
He found an entry in his journals, one that he probably would have taken out if he had read the journals
read them before he
gave
given
them to me, where he had gotten off the phone with Trump at some point in 2012, and he wrote, I actually kind of like this guy. He's funny,
hilarious.
He's outrageous. He's gossipy.
Breaks the monotony of the campaign, I think you said.
Exactly. He said he breaks up the monotony of the campaign trail. He lives by spirits. He goes, he wrote something
the
like,
real deal.
They just don't make him like Donald Trump anymore. And so when I was interviewing him, I read him that, and you could just see he was like, oh, geez, I can't believe I wrote that. But there was something I think important about that, which he eventually made this point, which is that it helps you understand how Trump has come to so fully dominate the Republican Party and Republican politicians, which is that yes, he wields his power over them and he bullies them and intimidates them, but he also seduces them in a way. He is, and I've actually spent time with him. Before he ever ran for office, I profiled him. Spoiler alert, didn't like my profile. But Trump is, in person, he has a charisma. There's a reason that he was a TV star. And Romney was responding to that, and it helped him understand why Trump was able to kind of take over the
And it
party.
wasn't the first time he had a positive reaction. He goes to Mar-a-Lago in 1995
Yeah, the mid-90s.
for Bain or somebody takes
Yeah,
him
it was
to
some kind of like, he had been invited because they were courting his business or something.
And Trump pulls him aside and shows him he thinks he's gotten away with something where there's a stash of maybe silver
Silverware. It was
plated.
gold silverware that he had found in Mar-a-Lago after buying it, and was trying to convince Romney that it was worth more than he paid for Mar-a-Lago. And
The seller didn't know it was in this closet.
And then, the
Same one where Trump hid documents
I'm
after he
gonna
left.
make a fortune on this and all this stuff, yeah. Anyway, Romney even then said, this guy is ridiculous, but he's funny and who cares, right? He didn't take him seriously. As for his relationship with Mike Lee, I do get into that toward the end of the book.
He wouldn't endorse him, right?
Romney famously, notoriously, depending on your view, refused to endorse Mike Lee's bid for re-election in 2022. And it really fractured their relationship. Mike Lee and Mitt Romney basically started out at the same place when it came to Donald Trump. Neither of them voted for Trump in 2016. Mike Lee, made a lot of, a big spectacle out of withdrawing his support for Trump after the Access Hollywood tape came out. And within a few years had fully gotten on board, was singing Trump's praises every chance he could. He compared Trump to a Book of Mormon hero in a rally. And Mitt just couldn't stomach it. He couldn't do it. They had a lot of policy disagreements in the Senate, and when Mike Lee got every other Republican senator to endorse him, Mitt Romney politely declined. And as you can imagine, Lee took it personally.
All right, 2 more questions, quickly.
So what is it that gives Mitt Romney hope today?
Good question. It's funny. I think that
It's a
this
good
book
question.
is in
Thanks.
some ways a Rorschach test, because some people I've talked to have said they got to the end of the book and were incredibly demoralized about the future of our country and our politics. And then some people have said they read it and found it inspiring and hopeful. And I guess it just depends on what you're bringing to the book. I found it hopeful, ultimately. And I guess I'll make the case, which is that, I talked about that map on Mitt Romney's Senate wall, and how America's exercise in self-government is ultimately a fraught and perilous thing that we can't take for granted. I do think that we're in a moment when a lot of Americans have woken up to that reality, and I'm an optimist, I guess. I believe that something good will be born out of that. I think that our collective realization that democracy is always one generation away from extinction, as a certain former president once said. I think that will lead to eventually greater civic hygiene and a redoubling of our commitment to preserving democracy in this country. I also think that, look, when I look at America's history, at least, we've been through darker periods than right now, and Mitt Romney will talk about this. I'll say, look, we're in a bad time, but his dad was in office in 1968 when there were race riots and very public assassinations, and it felt like the country was fracturing, and we got through it, right? And we've been through a civil war. We got through that. Mitt is not very optimistic that the current generation of political leaders is going to steer us toward a healthier direction, but he also recognizes that the current generation of political leaders is very old, and will not be in charge forever, and his hope is mainly placed in the next generation of political leaders. He believes that in both parties, the next generation will see what's happened and respond in a positive way and try to fix it. And I'll just put this plug in quickly before we get to the last question. Whatever your politics are and whatever you think of the Republican Party, we need two healthy political parties in this country, right? There will always be millions of conservative Americans, and they need a political home that is dedicated to democracy and the founding ideals of the country, even as it pursues a political philosophy that people on the left might disagree with. And I think what gives Mitt hope is that a lot of the younger conservatives he meets are not interested in recreating what Donald Trump has built, and they want to build something new.
As the locals will know, I'm an ardent Democrat, and I can say that I've been saying that for years to my Republican friends. We need a center-right party in this country. It's good for the Republic, and I think it's lost. We don't have it now, and maybe Romney and I may not live long enough, but you will to see it happen again.
Let's hope.
One more question.
Well, maybe a palate cleanser. I'm a journalist myself, so a little shop talk. It's my impression that the LDS culture journaling is a big part of LDS culture, and that, and I was wondering if Mitt Romney's journals were strictly political or a part of that culture, and is he a good writer?
Good question, Bill.
That's a very good question.
Thanks.
He did. There's no question that his very diligent journal keeping was born of his Mormon upbringing. Mormons are taught to keep journals, to keep records, to preserve history for their posterity, and that was definitely part of it. One thing I did approach the journals with a little bit of wariness at first because I was worried that they might have been legacy preservation documents, right? But it did not take very long to realize that these were not necessarily written for public consumption. There were a lot of things in there that kind of embarrassed him, or that were indiscreet things about his family or whatever. He really was just keeping journals. He said that he writes to clarify his thinking. He also writes to vent sometimes. One of the other forms of writing, just as an aside, as a senator, he probably writes one op-ed every week that his staff won't let him publish. And so what he would do was just send them to me when his staff wouldn't let him publish them. He'd say, Liz doesn't want me to publish this. Here, you read it. And it was very helpful. He is a good writer, actually. In fact, when he studied, his undergrad was literature, was English literature. And he wanted to, there was a brief period where he wanted to become an English professor and spend his life kind of reading Tolstoy and
Somebody told you that's a life of poverty, right?
His favorite professor said, "You will be broke and it's not worth doing. Go to law school or business school."
So he did both.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
One last thing, I asked him to think about this. It's fitting since you're here in the library. I want you to tell us 3 or 4 book recommendations you have for us before we go.
Oh, wow.
And I
Okay,
think,
yeah, that's right.
let me ask, Mark, are we signing books? All right. So you're going to sign your books. We'll have books. Wordsworth is our sponsor for selling the books. So
Yes, thank you.
get your book here outside, and
So,
McKay will sign it.
book recommendations. I'll just go through a couple. So my 11-year-old daughter, she just turned 11, discovered her love of reading just in the last year. And the book that did it for her was Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. It's a book about a Jewish family in Denmark during World War II and the efforts to keep them from the Nazis, hide them from the Nazis. It's a really moving book, short book. She fell in love with reading from it, so I have a sentimental attachment to it now.
It's a good thing to have a 5th grader who's telling you what to read. That's wonderful.
Exactly right. By the way, she's not so much interested in reading my books, but it's and I said, well, maybe when you're older, and she said, yeah, maybe. I'll just do another recent one that I actually am just reading for the first time. So I haven't finished it, so maybe I'll withhold my full endorsement, but I had never read Anna Karenina. I'm reading it now. Probably some people in this room have read it. I approached it with a little skepticism because sometimes when things are considered just these great masterpieces, I'm like, will it live up to the hype? But it has so far. And then there's one other book that I've been recommending on my book tour, which is it's called Less. And you had
He was on this stage
That's
in
right.
September, right,
It's
Mark?
one of the rare comic novels to win the Pulitzer. I think it came out in 2017 or something like that. It's sort of an author on a book tour. He's traveling the world to avoid confronting his ex-boyfriend's wedding. But a beautiful novel about a much more eventful book tour than I had. But when I read it shortly before I embarked on book tour, I was like, man, if I can have the existential crises that this guy had, this will be a very productive few
Nothing
months.
as challenging or threatening has happened to you in Little Rock, right? So far.
No,
right?
not yet. Not yet, but look, I don't leave till tomorrow morning, so we'll see.
Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for your book recommendations.
Thank you.